Henry I reigned as the King of England from 1100 to 1135 CE, the son of William the Conqueror. Henry succeeded his brother William II of England after he had died in a hunting accident and left no heir. A third brother, Robert Curthos, Duke of Normandy, was also ambitious for the throne, and the two battled to unify their two territories as their father had done. Henry took final victory in 1106 CE and imprisoned Robert for the rest of his life. Henry then enjoyed a long and largely peaceful reign, which saw the creation of such innovations as the Exchequer and travelling judges to apply the King's law everywhere. Without an heir, Henry was succeeded by his nephew Stephen, Count of Blois. Henry was born in September 1068 CE in Selby, Yorkshire, his father being William, Duke of Normandy, otherwise known as William the Conqueror or William I of England following his invasion of that country in 1066 CE. Henry's mother was Matilda of Flanders, who was the daughter of the Count of Flanders and the niece of Henry I of France. Matilda would be crowned the Queen of England in Westminster Abbey on the 11th of May 1068 CE. When William I died in 1087 CE, he was succeeded by his son William II, Rufus, who reigned for the next 13 years. A third brother, Robert, Duke of Normandy, had ambitions of his own, and so the three brothers became entwined in a deadly game for supremacy. Henry was the youngest son of the king, and so unlikely to get near the throne. He was prepared for a career in the medieval church. This plan had the advantage of educating the young prince, so that he was the only one of his brothers who was literate. Consequently, the prince earned a nickname, Henry Book. William II died unexpectedly on the 2nd of August, 1100 CE in the New Forest, as the result of a hunting accident when the nobleman William II fired a fateful arrow which bounced off the back of a fleeing stag and landed right in the center of William's chest. At the time, the incident was regarded as an accident, and Tyrrell was not punished for his part in the tragedy. It is, nevertheless, curious that William's younger brother and successor Henry was in the hunting party, and Robert Curthos was just then away fighting in the First Crusade, allowing Henry to forward himself as the next king. Certainly, Henry had not been slow to secure the royal treasury and his election by the ruling council, all within 48 hours of his brother's death. Thus, on the 6th of August 1100 CE, Henry I of England was crowned king in Westminster Abbey. Henry married twice. His first wife was Edith, the daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland, granddaughter of Edmund Ironside, King of England, for 1 year in 1016 CE, and the niece of Edgar F. Her excellent royal pedigree was further enhanced by adopting the Norman name of Matilda, perhaps also a tribute to Henry's mother. The couple married in November 1100 CE, and Matilda was crowned queen in the same year, her reign lasting until 1118 CE. This alliance strengthened the king's position in England by assuring certain barons he was the most useful and pedigree royal to support, as did his promises to the barons of a fairer treatment from the king in his Charter of Liberties, better described as an edict as it had no recipient, and, in any case, largely ignored by the king thereafter. Another point in Henry's favour was his recall, the same year, of the exiled Archbishop of Canterbury Anselm, who had fallen out of favour with William II. Consequently, there was a reconciliation between church and crown after William II had been accused of paganism and stealing revenues from lands held by the church. The first problem the king had to deal with was Henry's own hyper-ambitious brother Robert Curthos. Robert had a legitimate claim to the English throne, because William II had nominated him as successor. Indeed, the Duke of Normandy had already tried to wrest the throne from his father back in 1078-09 CE, when he had gained the support of Philip I of France. Robert had again challenged his father during the siege of Mantus in 1087. CE William II had experienced the same sort of problems with the ambitious Robert, and so the king invaded Normandy in 1091 CE. Then the two brothers had joined sides to defeat Henry at Mont Saint, confiscating his lands in the Cotentin Peninsula for themselves. Robert had fought with aplomb in the First Crusade, but now he was back in Europe and keen to press his claim for the English throne. In July 1101 CE he invaded England and landed at Portsmouth, but Robert, always flexible in his politics, instead of fighting, negotiated a deal whereby he received a handsome pension and Henry kept his crown. The truce lasted 5 years, but rebel barons in Normandy became enough of a threat for Henry to send an army to Normandy in 1106 CE. Henry defeated Robert once and for all in a pitched battle at Tingebrai in Normandy in September 1106 CE. Robert was then imprisoned for the remaining 28 years of his life, and Henry became both King of England and Duke of Normandy. Robert's son, William Cleet, would become a rallying point for rebel barons until his death in 1128 CE. The rest of Henry's reign was peaceful, even if it was likely more a regime of repression than harmony, given the events following Henry's death. There were rumblings of discontent over the king's high taxes, too, but at least no rebellion bubbled to the surface just yet. The church was still proving a little troublesome. The English kings had appointed senior clergy, and the papacy took offense at this, claiming that a layman could not have such authority over God's servants. Threatened with excommunication, Henry compromised and gave up his right of appointment. Although he did not give up his claims of certain church lands and their revenues, despite these differences, the king did sponsor certain church projects, notably building a new monastery at Reading and funding the new choir at Canterbury Cathedral in 1130 CE. The good relations between king and church are further indicated by Henry's use of the financial management skills of Roger, Bishop of Salisbury, who served in that capacity for 36 years, and who even acted as viceroy when the king was absent in Normandy. Henry's reign saw the creation of the Exchequer, essentially then a debt-collecting agency. The body, which derived its name from the use of a checkerboard cloth to count up debtors' accounts, first met in 1109 CE, and was managed by the all-powerful judge. The Exchequer produced various documents for the king to know better what his assets were and who had paid him what, and who owed him what. The latter information being recorded in the pipe rolls, which were organized by Even today, the finance minister of the UK government is called the Chancellor of the more significant than the catchy title. This was a major step in creating some form of bureaucratic government. Unfortunately, the greater knowledge of the financial state of his kingdom did not stop the king giving away vast swathes of royal lands and dispensing tax exemptions right, left and centre in an albeit successful effort to keep potentially rebellious barons loyal. This would have serious consequences for all of his successors as the balance of power, at least in terms of wealth, gradually shifted from the king to the aristocracy. In Henry's reign, 85% of royal income came from land. 150 years later, it would be only 40%. Taxes would have to supply the remainder. One final act of Henry's was another beginning to establish the idea that everyone, no matter if they lived on royal lands or not, and no matter how far from the royal court they lived, was subject to the king's law. Traveling judges were dispatched around the country to ensure everyone knew what that law was, and to apply it, and its punishments. This was a significant step towards creating a truly common law that was applicable anywhere in the country. Following Queen Matilda's death in 1118 CE, Henry married his second wife, Adeliza, the daughter of Godfrey I, Count of Louvain, who was crowned queen in 1121 CE. The couple had no children together. Henry died on the 1st of December 1135 CE at Saint Denis-le-Famant in Rouen, Normandy. Legend has it that the king died from overeating lamb. He was buried in Reading Abbey, which he had funded the building of. Crucially, the king did not leave a recognized male heir. His two legitimate sons, William and Richard, were both tragically drowned in the English Channel in 1120 CE when on board the ill-fated White Ship. The young princes had been sailing back from France, a trip which had sealed Henry's peace deal with King Louis VI, which formally bestowed Normandy on William when he became king. The White Ship's pilot was drunk, and the vessel hit a rock and sank nearby. All on board died except a Norman butcher. As a consequence of the White Ship disaster, only Henry's daughter Matilda survived the king, and it was she who Henry had nominated as his successor. Empress Matilda did at least have some good connections. She had, in 1114 CE, married Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, hence her title. But he had since died. Matilda remarried in 1128 CE, this time to Count Geoffrey of Anjou. The Count was also known by the nickname Plantagenet, because his family coat of arms included the broom plant. Despite her pedigree, the idea of a female ruler was not to the liking of many prominent barons, and they decided to ignore the dead king's wishes and appoint their own man, Stephen Count of Blois, then the richest baron in England, and a nephew of Henry I. The Count became King Stephen on the 26th of December 1135 CE, and he would reign, with a brief interruption, until his death in 1154 CE. It was far from being a peaceful reign, as there immediately followed Stephen's coronation, a period of civil war where loyalties were divided between the claims of Stephen and Empress Matilda. As a result of this war, the lands in Normandy were lost, and the Norman line of kings came to an end. The throne was then occupied by a new ruling dynasty, and their first king, Henry II of England, the son of Empress Matilda and Count Geoffrey of Anjou. Henry II of England ruled from 1154 to 1189 CE. He gained the throne by negotiation with his predecessor, King Stephen of England. Following the civil war that had raged between that monarch and Henry's mother, Empress Matilda, Henry would begin a new ruling dynasty, and he would rule until 1189 CE, forming the largest empire in Western Europe, and establishing himself as one of England's greatest ever kings. Two black marks, which became impossible to erase from memory, however, were the murder of his chancellor and then Archbishop Thomas Becket in 1170 CE, and the rebellions led by his own sons at the end of his reign. Henry was succeeded by his son Richard I of England, aka Richard the Lionheart, and then his other son, King John of England. Henry of Anjou was born on the 5th of March 1133 CE at Le Mans, France, the son of Geoffrey, Count of Anjou. Henry's mother was Empress Matilda, the daughter of Henry I of England, who had gained her title when marrying her first husband, Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. In 1114 CE, after Henry V's death, Matilda married again, this time to Geoffrey in 1128 CE. The Count became known by the nickname Plantagenet because his family coat of arms included the broom plant. Alternative theories for the origin of the name are that Count Geoffrey wore sprigs of the plant in his hat, or his lands were planted with it to provide good cover while hunting. The Plantagenets did not, of course, call themselves that name. The monarchs carried no the first three kings of the line, Henry II, Richard I, and King John, are sometimes referred to as the Angevins, after their ancestral lands. In Anjou, in northwest France, Henry II was known for his good looks, intelligence, and ability to speak several languages. Credited with boundless energy and drive, the king was of stocky build and had piercing grey eyes, red hair, and a ferocious temper to match. In later life, he was said to have had a significant paunch. Henry inherited his father's lands in Normandy, Anjou, Touraine, and Maine in 1151 CE. But he was ambitious for much more. Following military victories in Brittany, and in May 1152 CE, his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the former wife of Louis VII of France, Henry came to control most of France. Henry was ambitious to control England, weakened as it was by years of civil war. He and Eleanor would have 8 children, which included Richard I, the Lionheart or Coeur Lion, Geoffrey, Count of Brittany, Henry the young king, and King John of England. Returning back to 1135 CE, King Henry I of England had left no legitimate male heir, and so his nominated successor was his daughter, Matilda, whom the king had made his barons swear loyalty to. When it came to the actual coronation, though, many barons wanted neither a woman nor an Anjou count anywhere near the throne, and so supported instead the dead king's nephew and richest man in England, Stephen of Blois. Consequently, with some sharp manoeuvring, Stephen was crowned king in December 1135. Empress Matilda was undeterred, and a civil war broke out between barons who supported Stephen and those who favoured Matilda and her chief ally, Robert Fitzroy, Earl of Gloucester, an illegitimate son of Henry I. The war proved long and damaging, and neither side managed to gain the upper hand. Even if Matilda briefly became queen in 1141 CE, while Stephen was imprisoned at Bristol, Matilda's cause was gravely weakened following the death of Robert Fitzroy in 1147 CE, and she now focused her attention on the promotion of her son Henry. Henry attempted an invasion of England in 1147 CE, but his campaign came to an end when he ran out of funds, obliging his return to Normandy. Rather bizarrely, but entirely in keeping with Stephen's reputation for clemency, the English king paid for Henry's trip home. Another attack in 1149 CE, this time in the north of England, and with the assistance of David, the first of Scotland, was defeated by an army of Stephen's. At least Henry did not completely waste his time, as he was knighted by the Scottish king. In any case, Henry could bide his time, and once he had much greater resources at his disposal, he tried another invasion in 1153 CE. Third time lucky, finally brought an end to the civil war. In 1153 CE, King Stephen was something of a broken man. Following the death of his wife and son, Eustace, that year, he now faced Henry's third invasion and hoped for a decisive pitched battle. But in the event, neither side's soldiers or leaders were very keen on a fight. Consequently, on the 6th of November, Stephen signed with Henry the Treaty of War, which recognized him as Stephen's official heir. In return, Stephen was allowed to keep his crown for the rest of his life. The barons had no better candidate to support than Henry, and it was clear to all that the civil war had not done anybody any good, and the last thing England needed was another tussle for the throne. As one anonymous medieval chronicler put it, for 19 long winters, God and his angels slept. It was time for unity and peace. Consequently, when Stephen died on the 25th of October 1154 CE at Dover in Kent, Henry was crowned on the 19th of December 1154 CE at Westminster Abbey, and he became the first undisputed King of England for over a century. Henry's first important task was to bring the Anglo-Norman barons back into line after the period of civil war in England had enabled them to largely ignore royal authority and build castles, mint their own coinage, and generally deal with the peasantry how they wished without regard to the law. Many castles built in that period were of a temporary nature and not large stone edifices, but Henry was so determined to destroy them, he gained the nickname the Castle Breaker. Some of the stronger and older castles he kept for himself, such as Scarborough Castle, Nottingham Castle, Norwich Castle, and Castle Acre, to better ensure the law was equally applied everywhere in the country, a process begun by Henry I. The Assizes of Clarendon, established in 1166 CE principles of common law. Crown courts were set up, and trial by a jury of 12 men was established to punish those who broke it. A second area where royal power had been eroded was the borders of England. Both Scottish and Welsh rulers had taken advantage of King Stephen's preoccupation with Empress Matilda to increase their domains. Henry negotiated the return of Cumbria and Northumbria from Malcolm IV of Scotland, but conferred on him the earldom of Huntingdon, and allowed the Scottish king to keep the castle at Walk-upon-Tyne in 1157 CE. The Welsh princes, especially, required a more militaristic approach, but Henry achieved his aim of reasserting his authority in the west of his kingdom. From 1171 CE, a series of invasions were launched in Ireland against the dangerous Baron Richard Fitz. Eventually, the king's youngest son, John, was sent to rule there in place of the traditional High King. Treaties then formally recognised Henry's overlordship over Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Henry was further boosted by the support of Pope Adrian IV, who gave formal recognition of the English king's authority over all of Britain and Ireland. The king also maintained his interest in France. Indeed, he would spend 20 of his 35 years as king outside England. A third area where Henry sought to reaffirm the power of the monarchy was its relationship with the medieval church. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, who had also been the Chancellor and a great friend of the king, proved troublesome, and his murder in 1170 CE would overshadow Henry's reign, both at the time and ever since. Thomas had tried to defend the church's independence and block the crown's attempts to extract taxes from its lands and interfere in appointments. Neither side would budge, and in 1164 CE, Thomas was obliged to flee to a Cistercian monastery in France. 6 years later, Thomas returned to England in early December 1170 CE to recrown Henry the young king after the Pope had decided the original coronation, in which the Archbishop of York had performed the ceremony, was void. On his return to England, Thomas immediately began to suspend or excommunicate those bishops who had not supported him against the king. When Henry remarked, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights took this as a literal order, and so they searched out and murdered Thomas while he was praying in Canterbury Cathedral on the 29th of December 1170 CE. The murder shocked the establishment, and the Pope even made Thomas into a saint in 1173 CE. Fortunately for Henry, papal legates found the king innocent of Thomas's death, although in 1174 CE he did have to perform a symbolic act of penance by visiting the dead archbishop's tomb in the cathedral in which he was murdered. Monks, armed with branches, performed a penitential flogging of the king for good measure. 1173 CE proved to be quite a bad year for the king, as his sons and wife rebelled against his rule from this point onwards. Eleanor of Aquitaine had become increasingly exasperated by her husband's unwillingness to delegate any real power to her and his infidelity, especially his public relationship with the noblewoman Rosamond Clifford, famed for her beauty. Around 1170 CE, Eleanor effectively separated from her husband and set up her own court in Poitiers. Her favourite son Richard went with her. Meanwhile, Henry, well aware of the succession problems that had bedeviled his Norman predecessors, tried to cover himself as best he could by not only nominating his eldest son, Henry, as his successor, but even having him crowned king designate in 1170 CE. As we have seen, this was a common enough policy amongst French sovereigns, and is why the heir is often referred to as Henry the Young King. Besides becoming King of England, the younger Henry was also to acquire the family lands in Anjou and Normandy. The other 3 sons, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, were to receive Aquitaine, Brittany and Ireland, respectively. All these careful plans were then thrown out of the window when in 1173 CE, the young Henry, Eleanor, and several prominent barons upset over Thomas Becket's murder launched an 80-month rebellion against the king. Despite the rebels having Sir William Marshal on their side, often described as the greatest ever medieval knight, as well as Richard, who would earn himself a reputation as a great military leader, and his brother Geoffrey and William the Lion of Scotland, the rebellion was quashed by the end of 1174 CE. The king's preoccupation with castles had paid dividends. The trouble was a great expense for the crown, with huge sums of money spent on strengthening such key fortresses as Windsor Castle and Dover Castle, amongst many others, and building the technologically advanced Orford Castle in Suffolk. After the rebellion, Eleanor was imprisoned in various castles, only to be released in 1184 CE. Henry the young king died of dysentery on the 11th of June 1183 CE. Geoffrey then died in an accident at a medieval tournament on the 19th of August 1186 CE, leaving Richard as the heir to the English throne. Despite the fact John had been the only one loyal to his father, Richard remained impatient, though, and was not quite finished with his schemes to replace his father. In mid-1189 CE, he joined forces with Philip II of France, technically Richard's feudal overlord of his lands in France, and the pair were even supported by John against his father. Henry II, with everyone against him, was thus obliged to sign a peace deal and formally recognize the French king as his regarding those lands he still held in France, and to nominate Richard as his heir in England. Henry died of natural causes on the 6th of July 1189 CE at Chinon Castle, and betrayed by his own nearest and dearest. Legend has it the king's dying words were shame, shame on a vanquished king. The dead monarch was buried at Fontevraud Abbey in France. Henry, as agreed, was succeeded by his son Richard, who was crowned on the 2nd of September 1189 CE at Westminster Abbey. The kingdom still faced a serious threat from the scheming Philip II, who was ambitious to expand his own territory. Philip conspired with John to make him king instead of Richard, while the latter was away on the Third Crusade, and then held in captivity by Henry VI, Holy Roman Emperor. Richard was freed 2 years later thanks to the payment of a ransom organized by his mother, but when he died in battle in 1199 CE, John did at last become king, reigning until 1216 CE in all, and albeit under different house names after 1399 CE, the Plantagenets would see 14 kings rule England for 331 years, making them the longest-lasting royal dynasty in the country's history. Henry III of England ruled from 1216 to 1272 CE. The son of the unpopular King John of England, Henry was immediately faced with the ongoing Barons' War, which had been fueled by discontent over John's rule and his failure to honour the Magna Carta Charter of Liberties. Henry and his regent Sir William Marshal defeated the rebel barons in battle at Lincoln in 1217 CE, but his reign was beset thereafter with problems. Traditionally viewed as a weak and often ineffectual king, Henry, like his father before him, wasted money on military campaigns without any results, and these necessitated such high taxes that the barons rebelled for a second time. The rebel leader, Simon de Mont, captured Henry and made himself the most powerful man in the kingdom in 1264 CE. Fortunately for Henry, his son Edward raised an army and defeated de Montfort at Eve. Henry was restored but spent much of his later years away from politics and improving the country's architectural monuments, such as Westminster Abbey and Lincoln Cathedral. Following Henry's death from natural causes in 1272 CE, Prince Edward, who had in some respects been his father's regent, became Edward of England. Henry was born on the 1st of October 1207 CE, at Winchester Palace in Hampshire, the son of King John of England and Queen Isabella of England. The young prince would be thrust into the limelight of state before any preparation was possible. King John died of fever on the 18th of October 1216 CE, when Henry was still only 9 years old. John had died in the middle of the First Barons' War, which was caused by the king not honouring the promises set out in the Magna Carta of June 1215 CE. This Charter of Liberties established that even the sovereign was subject to the rule of law and the barons should be consulted on matters affecting them. So upset were some of these aristocrats with their present king, they supported Prince Louis as a replacement. Louis had invaded southern England and captured many of its prime castles, including the Tower of London. In May 1216 CE, Louis had even proclaimed himself king based on the fact he was married to Blanche of Castile, granddaughter of Henry II of England. Amongst this turmoil, Henry III succeeded his father and was crowned king on the 28th of October 1216 CE in Gloucester Cathedral. The rush job ceremony was further spoiled by the absence of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the lack of any royal regalia, King John having lost the crown jewels in quicksand when he was fleeing from the rebel barons. In the absence of a crown with any pedigree, a gold torque necklace of Henry's mother, Queen Isabella, was used instead. Henry's first task, then, was to bring an end to the civil war that blighted his kingdom. Henry was only 9 years old, but he did have help from such figures as Peter de Roches and Hubert de Burgh, and one truly great ally, Sir William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, often considered the greatest medieval knight of all. Marshal had served 3 kings already, and he was now made the protector of the kingdom, in effect, regent of England for the young Henry. This unlikely pairing of a child king and a 70-year-old knight would prove to be a winning one. Crucially, the king held on to Windsor Castle and Dover Castle, so that Henry could face the remaining rebel barons and Prince Louis at Lincoln. On the 20th of May, 1217 CE, Marshal led the English army in person, and just before the battle he gave a rousing speech to his front-line troops, declaring that the enemy had so positioned their forces that he would win the day, because he could attack with all his army at a single section of the opposition. And so it turned out. A French reinforcement fleet of 80 ships was sunk in the Channel on the 24th of August by an English fleet of 40 ships commanded by Hubert de Burgh. The English fleet feigned an attack but then manoeuvred to come at the French downwind. Crossbow fire and pots of quicklime were launched at the enemy, and in the confusion, only 15 French ships escaped. After this double defeat, Louis renounced his claim to the English throne in a treaty signed in September 1217 CE. The victory permitted Henry to enjoy a proper, full pomp and ceremony, coronation, at Westminster Abbey on the 17th of May 1220 CE. William Marshal, meanwhile, having now served 4 kings in his illustrious life, died on the 14th of May 1219 CE. The new regent was Hubert de Burgh, who had served as justiciar, as well as defeating the French navy, but he would be needed for only a few more years. Henry took on direct rule in January 1227 CE, aged 20. The historian Don Jones gives the following description of the king. The man that emerged from the long road out of childhood was a peculiar specimen. Henry was about 5 feet 6 inches in height. He was said to have a drooping eyelid, which would have given his face a crooked solemnity to match his somewhat ponderous character. He was noticeably pious, even in an age where the rising fashion among kings was for asceticism and ostentatious religiosity. What the king lacked in good looks, he certainly made up for in longevity. However, the king quickly gained a reputation for being indecisive and easily swayed. Even worse, the barons never took to him. perceiving him as just as arrogant of his rights and disrespectful of theirs as King John had been. Another criticism was that the king was rather too generous with land grants to foreigners. This was worsened after his marriage to Eleanor of Pro on the 20th of January 1236 CE, and an influx of French in-laws took key positions at court, even becoming close advisors to the king and fueling his incendiary idea that the monarch had absolute authority and need not listen to his barons. There were some good points to Henry, at least from posterity's view. The king was a great patron of the arts and sponsored many important building projects, such as the new St. Albans Cathedral, Lincoln Cathedral, Wells Cathedral, and Salisbury Cathedral. There was a major upgrade of Westminster Palace, making the traditional royal residence altogether more comfortable with new windows, fireplaces, wall paintings, and plumbing. Westminster Abbey was renovated in the Gothic style, and a magnificent new shrine was built therein to the former king, Edward the. The abbey was also given by the king a Christophile thought to contain the blood of Jesus Christ. Yet another building to receive the king's attention was the Tower of London. Henry probably started the zoo there, which would remain until 1835. The first animals were usually diplomatic gifts, such as leopards, an elephant, and even a polar bear. Finally, the king was very keen on education, and, between 1249 and 1264, he created or funded the first 3 colleges at Oxford University. Architectural and educational achievements were hardly the way to win over his subjects, though, and, in any case, these were mostly done in his final decade of rule. Certainly, they did nothing to stay the negative reaction to the king's heavy taxation policies. A string of military defeats in Wales, which led to Henry conferring on Llywelyn ap Gruffydd the title of Prince of Wales, and a bungled attempt to collude with Pope Innocent IV, and make Henry's second son, Prince Edmund, the King of Sicily. Then there were ineffectual campaigns across the Channel in 1228-1230 CE and 1242 CE, resulting in the ultimate loss of territories in France, signed away in the Treaty of Paris in 1259 CE, which left nothing to the English crown except Gascony. Finally, the king's arrangement of the marriage of his sister Isabella to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, an act backed by the ruling council, necessitated a huge cash dowry that stretched the taxation system to its very limits. In short, Henry, on an annual income that was half that of his French counterpart, Louis IX of France, was living beyond his means. All of these disappointments exasperated the barons, to such an extent that some supported the king's brother-in-law Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, and made him, in effect, co-ruler with Henry. The provisions of Oxford set out that taxes should go to the treasury and not be available for the king's whims, and that a ruling council of 15 barons should advise the king. The council was also to control royal castles, supervise ministerial appointments, and control local administration. Another body, which some historians credit de Montfort as calling a parliament, meaning a body for discussion of policy, was when knights of the counties and burgesses of certain boroughs were invited to participate the beginnings of the English Parliament. The Parliament was also designed to ensure the council was performing its duty. In 1261 CE, Henry called on the Pope to restore his full control of the kingdom, and he repudiated the provisions of Oxford in 1262 CE, a decision backed by Louis IX of France. Consequently, civil war broke out. On the 14th of May 1264 CE, de Montfort captured Henry and his son, Prince Edward, at the Battle of Lewes. For the next year, Henry has ignominiously shifted about as part of de Montfort's travelling entourage, although de Montfort claimed himself to be, in effect, king. and he forced Henry to sign laws and decrees in his favour. Edward managed to escape his captors in May 1265 CE. The prince then formed an army of loyal supporters of his father, and those barons already disgruntled with the self-seeking de Montfort. On the 4th of August 1265 CE, at the Battle of Evesham in Worcestershire, Edward was victorious, thanks to his having a larger army than his opponent. De Montfort was killed and his body terribly mutilated. Edward reinstated his father as king, but took over some aspects of the daily running of the kingdom himself. It seemed Henry was destined to share his power at both ends of his reign. Henry died, probably of a stroke, on the 16th of November 1272, CE, age 65. He had reigned for an impressive 56 years, a record that would not be beaten until George III of England. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, and succeeded by his son, who had already been ruling in his name, and who now became Edward I of England. Edward was crowned on the 19th of August 1274 CE at Westminster Abbey, and he would reign until 1307 CE. The new king would subdue Wales, have a good go at conquering Scotland, embark on what is sometimes called the Ninth Crusade, and build many fine castles, which still survive today, particularly in North Wales. Henry IV of England ruled as king from 1399 to 1413 CE, known as Henry Duke of Lancaster. Before he became king, Henry clashed with his cousin Richard II of England, and was exiled in 1397 CE, returning to England with a small army in the summer of 1399 CE. Henry made himself king as Richard's support collapsed. Kicking off his reign with the murder of his predecessor, Henry would face major rebellions in both England and Wales, and he frequently clashed with Parliament, particularly the Long Parliament of 1406 CE. Henry was the first of the kings from the House of Lancaster, and he was succeeded by his son Henry V of England. Henry was born in April 1366 CE at Bolingbroke Castle in Lincolnshire, the son of John of Gaunt, himself the son of Edward III of England, and so a claimant for the throne of Richard II. John was a powerful but unpopular figure who had been passed over for the throne because he had supported corrupt nobles and officials identified by Parliament. Henry Bolingbroke's mother was Blanche of Lancaster, daughter of the Duke of Lancaster. The young nobleman was given the title Earl of Derby, the first of many he would acquire over his career. Henry married Mary of Boreham on the 5th of February 1381 CE, but she died during childbirth in 1394 CE. The couple's most famous son was Henry, future Henry V, born on the 16th of September 1387 CE. Henry, now king, married again on the 7th of February 1403 CE, this time to Joan of Navarre. Henry had a typical noble upbringing where he showed a flair for the medieval tournament, courage, piety, and an interest in literature. The young Henry had his share of adventure when he twice went to fight pagans in Lithuania as part of the Northern Crusades, alongside Teutonic Knights. There would also be a pilgrimage to Jerusalem before he concentrated on his ambitions in England. By 1386, CE had risen to be one of the foremost barons in England, and he was a member of the disgruntled group of noblemen who took exception to the king's favouritism towards Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford. Richard had made the hugely unpopular de Vere the Duke of Ireland in December 1387. The dissatisfied barons made their move by defeating de Vere and his supporters at the Battle of Radcot Bridge near Oxford. Henry was then one of the 5 Lords Appellant, who called the Merciless Parliament, to take power away from the still young Richard II. The king would get his revenge, though, in 1397 CE, when, older, wiser, and more secure on his throne, he rounded up the conspirators and had them executed or exiled. Henry, the king's cousin, was, fortunately for him, in the latter category. Initially it seemed Henry had survived the King's Purge, but a quarrel between Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, the two surviving lords of which was engineered by Richard, resulted in the two dukes facing each other in a medieval joust in Coventry in September 1398 CE, with a huge crowd waiting expectantly to witness the finale of an event rich in pageantry. The king stepped forward and forbade the two to fight. Richard then exiled Mowbray for life and Bolingbroke for 10 years. Henry went off to Paris, but he would be back in England far sooner than Richard had hoped. On the 3rd of February 1399 CE, John of Gaunt died, and so Henry became the Duke of Lancaster. Henry now had an excuse to return to England. He could claim he wanted back what was rightfully his, the Lancaster family's lands, which Richard had taken for himself. The king had also extended Henry's exile from 10 years to life. As it turned out, though, Henry would be back not only to claim his estates, but also a much bigger prize. Henry set off from Boulogne and landed at Spurn Head, northeast England, with a small army, perhaps only 300 men, and then marched south to press his claim in June-July 1399 CE. The timing of the invasion was excellent, because Richard was then away in Ireland. Without their king, the royalist support faded away, perhaps too, because Richard had never been all that popular with his odd choice of court companions and distinct lack of verve in taking the war to the French during the 100 Years' War. The war with the French had started fantastically well for England, but by Richard's reign, Charles V of France, aka Charles the Wise, had ensured that the only lands left in France belonging to the English crown were Calais and a thin slice of Gascony. French pirates were running riot in the English Channel, and many English barons wanted a more direct war than the fizzled-out one they were currently witnessing. Richard failed in two of the most important areas a medieval king was expected to do well: win military victories to bring in money and lands, and produce a male heir. When these failures were added to his dictatorial approach to government, it becomes clearer why the barons entertained the idea of a change in ruler, especially as Henry was a capable military leader, had a forceful personality, and was of royal blood himself. In August 1399 CE, Richard was back from Ireland and, enticed out of hiding in Conwy Castle in Wales, only to be then imprisoned in the Tower of London. On the 29th of September, Henry obliged Richard to sign his own abdication. On the 30th of September, Parliament officially nominated Henry as Richard's successor, and so Henry Bolingbroke was crowned Henry IV of England on the 13th of October 1399 CE in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. In a curious incident, the king dropped the gold coin that newly crowned monarchs were supposed to ceremoniously offer to God. The coin rolled away and was never seen again, an ill omen indeed. To signal the beginning of a new era, on the eve of his coronation, Henry had created a new group of medieval knights called the Knights of Bath. Henry, who himself took a bath every week, an unusual frequency for the Middle Ages, created 46 such knights, and they all had to have a bath as a mark of purification and be blessed by a priest before they were invested. On the 14th of February, 1400 CE, the ex-king was murdered in Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, almost certainly, because there had been some, albeit minor, efforts by those loyal to Richard to set him back on the throne. Henry even put the body of Richard on public display in the Tower of London, in case any would-be rebels thought he might still be alive and ready to head a coup. The Plantagenets, who had ruled England since Henry II of England, were now replaced by the House of Lancaster. Henry faced an immediate crisis in September 1400 CE in Wales, where Owain Glyndwr had declared himself the Prince of Wales. Even more ominously, the Welshman had the support of the Earl of March, whose son, Edmund Mortimer, as the great-great-grandson of Edward III, was a possible claimant to Henry's throne, also supporting the Welsh, were the French, taking, as usual, any opportunity to destabilize the English throne. Meanwhile, English barons were plotting a rebellion of their own in England. The group of discontents included such notable names as the Earl of Worcester, the Earl of Northumberland, and the celebrated medieval knight, Sir Henry Hotspur. Henry first turned to the English problem and met in battle the rebellious barons on the 21st of July, 1403. CE, at the Battle of Shrewsbury, the king's army was victorious. Henry fought with courage. Sir Percy was killed and Worcester executed. The Earl of Northumberland, Earl of March, and other rebel barons would not give up so easily, and they changed strategy and began to conspire with the Archbishop Scrope of York and Owain Glyndwr. King Henry discovered this plot to carve up his kingdom from under his feet, and the Earl of Northumberland fled to Scotland. Things improved for Henry as the decade wore on. In March 1406 CE, the young Prince James, the future James, the first of Scotland, was captured when his ship was wrecked off the east coast of England. Prince James was kept as a prisoner in the Tower of London and a hefty ransom demanded for his release. Unfortunately for James, his father died soon after, and although he became the King of Scotland, nobody came forward with the ransom. And so he was kept in comfortable confinement for 18 years. In February 1408 CE, after Henry won the Battle of Bramham Moor against the combined Welsh and English rebels, Edmund Mortimer was imprisoned, and both the Archbishop of York and the Earl of Northumberland were executed. In 1409 CE, the Welsh rebellion was finally quashed when the last rebels were captured at Harlech Castle. Owain Glyndwr retreated to the mountains and was never heard of again. Henry's namesake son had led the army that regained Harlech, capturing the eldest son of Owain Glyndwr in the process, and he was fast becoming the star of the royal court. Prince Henry, who was the real Prince of Wales, also led an army to France to exploit the anarchy there following the descent into madness of King Charles VI of France. But the expedition came to nothing. Still, the prince was outshining his father, and there developed some friction between the two, especially over the prince's desire to take a more militaristic approach with their great rival France. The younger Henry's time would come soon enough. Another source of friction at court was the king's relationship with Parliament. The so-called Long Parliament of 1406 CE sat an unusually long time from March until December as it deliberated over the ever-prickly issue of state finances. Parliament was not impressed with the lack of success against the Welsh rebels or the presence of French troops in Wales. The king's high taxes were not yielding any results on the field of battle. The court spending was considered excessive, and Parliament insisted that, at the very least, the king must listen to its concerns before endorsing a new round of taxes. Thus, the Long Parliament was another small step on the long road to a constitutional monarchy. Henry IV died on the 20th of March, 1413. CE. He was only around 46 and had been wasting away, racked by disease, possibly leprosy or severe eczema, since 1406 CE. In addition, the king suffered multiple strokes at the end of his life, and this when his mind had already long been troubled with remorse for his treatment of King Richard. He was buried in Canterbury Cathedral. Henry was succeeded by his 25-year-old son, Henry V of England, who was crowned in Westminster Abbey on the 9th of April 1430. CE. Henry V became one of the great fighting monarchs of European history by defeating the French at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. CE and going on to capture Normandy and Paris. However, his reign would be brief, cut short by illness, and the ousting of the legitimate King Richard would come to haunt the Lancaster descendants, as the two houses of Lancaster, and York battled for the throne in what became known as the Wars of the Roses. Henry V of England ruled as king from 1413 to 1422. Succeeding his father Henry IV of England, Prince Henry established himself as a fine military leader in battles against English and Welsh rebels in the first decade of the 1400s. As king, Henry masterminded a famous victory against the French at the Battle of Agincourt in October 1415, went on to capture Normandy and Paris, and was even nominated as heir to the French throne. Henry's spectacular reign then came to a sudden and unexpected end when he died, probably of dysentery, in August 1422 while on campaign in France. He was succeeded by his son Henry VI of England. Henry was born on the 16th of September 1387 at Monmouth Castle, the son of Henry IV of England, the first of the kings of the House of Lancaster, and Mary of the ousting of Richard II of England by Henry IV in 1399, and the murder of the ex-king in Pontefract Castle in 1400 would come back to haunt the House of Lancaster, but for now, Prince Henry had no doubts about his role in the world. To one day rule England, and then to conquer France. Henry, often called Henry of Monmouth, prior to his accession, was a very pious individual, and developed a taste for an ascetic lifestyle as king. But, in his youth, he was known for his partying. The young Henry spent time at Richard Escourt, even when his father was exiled. And he also learnt about arms and warfare from his guardian, the celebrated medieval knight Sir Henry Hotspur Percy. Indeed, the prince learnt rather too well from the old master, and when the Hotspur turned against the king, he was killed at the Battle of Shrewsbury in July 1403, in which the 16-year-old Henry fought with a Although he received a facial wound for his trouble, Prince Henry led the king's army, which finally quashed the Welsh rebellion led by Owain Glyndwr. Perhaps Henry had been especially miffed that Owain had declared himself the Prince of Wales, which, as the English king's eldest son, was rightfully Henry's title. In 1409 the rebel stronghold at Harlech Castle was captured, and Owain Glyndwr retreated to the mountains, never to be seen again. The prince next led an army to France to exploit the anarchy there following the descent into madness of King Charles VI of France. But the expedition came to nothing. Still, the prince was outshining his father, and there developed some friction between the two, especially over the prince's desire to take a more militaristic approach with their great rival France, and resume in earnest the on-off conflict that is known to history as the 100 Years' War. Henry IV died of illness on the 20th of March 1413. The king's health had been in decline since 1406, and Prince Henry had already taken over some of the king's duties. Prince Henry, aged just 25, was crowned Henry V on the 9th of April 1413 in Westminster Abbey. While a blizzard raged outside, the new king took his new responsibility seriously and banished all his old rollicking and roistering comrades from his presence, forbidding any of them to come within 10 miles of his person. The king also sported what seems to modern eyes an unusual haircut, but this was in the style of soldiers, and indicated the king meant business when he said to his dying father that he would defend his crown with his sword. The king would need his sword sooner than he thought, when he had to deal with a murder plot in 1415, known to history as the Southampton Plot. The plan was to put Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, and great-grandson of Edward III of England, on the throne. The conspirators were led by Sir Thomas Grey, Henry, Lord Scrope of and the Earl of Cambridge, who was the grandson of Edward III. All three were executed in August 1415, after Mortimer had himself informed the king of the plot. Henry was not merely a warrior king, though, and during his reign he encouraged the use of the English language in official documents, and literature, as opposed to the previously dominant French language. Another area of concern to the king was the medieval church and the heresy of the law. These heretics believed that anyone could pray in private, and so the church as an institution need not be the bridge between God and humanity. Further, one of the Lollard exponents, the theologian John Wick, called for a redistribution of the church's wealth, an idea taken up by members of the dangerous peasants' revolt of 1381, by persecuting the Lollard, putting down riotous Lollard demonstrations in January 1414, and even imprisoning for heresy his own friend, Sir John Oldcastle. Henry thus acquired the full support of the church, an indispensable ally when it came to gathering the cash needed for his planned military campaigns. The 100 Years' War between England and France had started remarkably well for the English during the reign of Edward III, aided by his son Edward the Black Prince. Great victories were won in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356. However, Charles V of France, aka Charles the Wise, steadily regained the initiative, and by 1375 the only lands left in France belonging to the English crown were Calais and a thin slice of Gascony. Now, though, with the demise of Charles VI, the French nobles were divided and the country in chaos. In addition, the longbows used by English armies were still the most devastating weapon the medieval battlefield had yet witnessed. Henry IV and his son had disagreed over policy towards France and which faction to back. Those led by the Duke of Burgundy or the supporters of the Duke of Orleans. Henry V was now keen to make good on his failed expedition in France, when a prince, and to take a much more decisive course of action against the old enemy. With French pirates running riot in the English Channel, and the chance of land and booty in the event of an invasion of a teetering France, the majority of English barons and the Parliament were enthusiastic for action. Another helpful factor was the stability of the Welsh and Scottish borders. In order to win the support of any waverers, Henry reinstated the estates of those lords his father had been against, and, in a show of conciliation with the wrongs of the past, had the body of Richard II reburied in Westminster Abbey, with the country behind him. Henry was ready to pursue the claim that had started with Henry's great-grandfather, Edward III, the nephew of Charles IV of France. The English king was also the rightful king of France. Even the royal coat of arms still showed the 3 lions of England and the fleur-de-lis of France. To give himself time to assemble funds and his army, Henry made diplomatic advances towards both of the French factions in 1415. Nothing came of these discussions, except, as the story goes, the son and heir of Charles VI, sent the young Henry a box of tennis balls with a note he should concentrate on sports rather than war. Henry showed his clear intent when, in mid, he invaded Normandy with an army of around 10,000 men and captured the port of Harfleur after a grueling 5-week siege. The French had not been wasting time during this first part of the invasion, and the Constable of France, Charles d'Albert, assembled an army of around 20,000 men to meet the enemy and overwhelm them with sheer numbers. The two armies met on St. Crispin's Day, the 25th of October 1415, near the village of The ground was in a shocking state for a battle and presented a field of mud for both sides. The English had lighter armor than their French counterparts, and this proved very useful in the battle conditions. Yet again, though it was the longbow that proved decisive as the English archers fired at the enemy from 3 sides, French knights were knocked off their horses and had their armor pierced by the powerful English arrows. The French losses were astonishing. Around 7,000 men to the English, dead of perhaps as few as 500. The figures were so high for the French because Henry had ordered the execution of prisoners when a contingent of the enemy attacked the English baggage train in the rear, and so the king feared the fighting might start anew. Amongst the fallen were most of the French nobility, including several dukes and counts, a situation which meant there was limited resistance to Henry's next moves. In terms of large field armies clashing, the king had once again led his troops from the front, even if he had received a heavy bash to his helmet. The Duke of Orleans was captured at Agincourt, and he eventually found himself a prisoner in the Tower of London for the start of his 25 years of confinement in England. Between 1417 and 1419, Henry conquered Normandy by persistent siege warfare of strategically important cities and fortifications. Caen, for example, was taken in 1417, after a siege where no quarter was given by either side. Henry forbade his men from plundering, but despite once hanging an archer for stealing a small box from a church, this was difficult to always enforce. The king famously captured Rouen, the Norman capital, in January 1419, after a siege where the king's artillery batteries were used and a ruthless Henry ordered dead animals thrown into any wells, which eventually caused so much disease in the town that it was forced to capitulate. Consequently, Normandy was now in Henry's control and land was parcelled out to loyal followers. At the end of 1419, Henry set his sights on Paris. Supporters of the Duke of Burgundy, after the Duke's father was murdered by a French rival, crucially gave their backing to Henry's claim to be ruler of France as well as England. This arrangement was sealed in May 1420 with the Treaty of Troyes. According to this treaty, Henry would be made the King of France, following the death of Charles VI. The new regime would be tied to the old, via the marriage of the English king to Charles' daughter Catherine of Valois. Finally, Henry had to promise he would continue fighting against the Burgundian's number one enemy, the now disinherited Dauphin Charles. On the 2nd of June 1420, in Troyes Cathedral, Henry V did indeed marry Catherine, and the war was resumed against the Dauphin. Henry was at the peak of his powers, the most potent ruler in Western Europe. In 1421, the royal couple returned to England, where they were welcomed by a show of pageantry and choirs in the streets of London, and Catherine had her coronation ceremony on the 6th of December 1421. At Windsor Castle, Henry's only child was born. Another Henry. The wheel of fortune was already turning for the English king, though in March 1421, the English lost at the Battle of, and Henry's own brother, Thomas, Duke of Clarence, was killed. Henry headed back to France to resume the war, and so he never saw his son born or at any time thereafter. The king enjoyed one more success on the 11th of May 1422, capturing Meaux after an 8-month siege. Henry's career had been glittering, but it was also to be short. Henry died, probably of dysentery, aged 35, on the 31st of August 1422, at Bois de Vincennes, in France. The English king had missed the chance to become the King of France by less than 2 months. Charles VI died on the 21st of October 1422. Henry's body was returned to England and buried at Westminster Abbey, and he was succeeded by his infant son, crowned Henry VI, in November 1429. Again in Westminster Abbey, the infant's regents had already been appointed by his father, Duke of Gloucester for England and John, Duke of Bedford for France. Both were brothers of Henry V. Henry VI's reign turned out to be long, despite an interruption during the 1460s, but he could not stop a grand French revival which included the heroic efforts of Joan of Arc, a view which benefited greatly from his heroic treatment by William Shakespeare in his play Henry V, which contains the following stirring lines, spoken by Henry to his army just before the Battle of Agincourt, and the crowning of the Dauphin as King Charles VII of France. Henry had continued to press a claim for the French throne, eventually being crowned as such in the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris in December 1431, although loyalists to Charles VII disputed his right to do so. Henry VI, who suffered from bouts of insanity, met a sticky end, murdered in the Tower of London in May 1471, as the two houses of Lancaster and York battled for the throne in what later became known as the Wars of the Roses. Henry V's legacy might have crumbled quicker than he hoped, but he has at least gone down in history as one of England's great kings, and Crispian shall ne'er go by, from this day to the ending of the world. But we in it shall be remembered, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, but he ne'er so vile. This day shall gentle his condition, and gentlemen in England, now abed, shall think themselves accursed. They were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, while any speaks, that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. Henry VI of England ruled as king from 1422 to 1461, and again from 1470 to 1471. Succeeding his father Henry V of England, Henry VI was crowned the King of France in 1431, but he could not prevent a French revival led by Charles VII of France, and such figures as Joan of Arc. The 100 Years' War was ultimately lost, and with it all England's territory in France, except Calais. Back in England, the king's weakness of character and mind, and the intense rivalry between his barons, led to the conflict known as the Wars of the Roses between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. After an episode of insanity, Henry VI had, in effect, a regent, Richard, the Duke of York, in 1454. Despite military victories by Henry's wife, Queen Margaret, the king was ultimately deposed by Richard's son Edward in 1461. Henry would make a brief return to the throne in 1470 before Edward, now Edward IV of England, was once more victorious on the battlefield and able to declare himself king for a second time. Henry was then murdered in the Tower of London in May 1471. Henry was born on the 6th of December 1421 in Windsor Castle, the son of Henry V of England and Catherine of Valois, the daughter of Charles VI of France. The reign of Henry's father was short but brilliant, pressing his claim to the French throne, which had started with Edward III of England. Henry V had won a famous victory against a French army at the Battle of Agincourt in October 1415, and then conquered Normandy between 1417 and 1419. This was to be the peak of English fortunes during the on-off conflict between the two countries known to history as the 100 Years' War. The victories allowed Henry V to sign the 1420 Treaty of Troyes with Charles VI of France, which made Henry the French king's heir, while the blood heir, the Dauphin Charles, was disinherited. All this happened while France was split between two rival factions, the Burgundians and the Henry V died, probably of dysentery, on the 31st of August 1422 at Bois de Vincennes in France. The English king had missed the chance to become the King of France by less than 2 months. Charles VI died on the 21st of October 1422. Prince Henry, not even 1 year old, became the new King of England, and the youngest to hold such a title before or since. He would not receive his coronation until the 6th of November 1429 in Westminster Abbey, officially becoming Henry VI of England. In the meantime, the infant had 2 regents, appointed by Henry V before his death: Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, for England, and John, Duke of Bedford, for the territories in France, where, at least according to the Treaty of Troyes, he was also now the king. Another important figure was the king's great-uncle, Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester. These three men and others would entangle themselves in a spiral of competition to see who could hold most power while Henry remained a minor. All the big battles of the 100 Years' War had been won by the English, but taking and then controlling French territory was another matter. To keep large armies in the field was hugely expensive and beyond the means of the English treasury to maintain. He was simple in mind. He was peace-loving, compassionate, pious to the point of prudery, and generous to his friends. But the French fight back began in 1429. When an army led by Joan of Arc in 1429 relieved the siege of Orleans, Sir John Talbot, the great medieval knight known as the English Achilles, won many victories thanks to his aggressive tactics and surprise attacks. In February 1437, Talbot added to his now legendary reputation by ordering his men to march across ice at dawn and take Pontoise while the garrison there were still feeling the after-effects of their Shrove Tuesday celebrations the night before. Talbot won yet another victory against high odds in 1439, defeating a French army led by Constable Rit. The fates caught up with the great knight eventually, and he was killed at the Battle of Castellon in July 1453. In 1434-5, Talbot orchestrated the successful defence of English-held Paris against a French army in January 1436. While defending Rouen, Talbot launched one of his famous surprise attacks and routed a much larger French army at the Battle of Rheims. However, the year before, in 1435, the English had crucially lost the support of their allies, the Burgundians, who joined with Charles VII by the Treaty of Arras to end the French Civil War. This permitted the Dauphin to be crowned Charles VII of France in Reims on 17 July 1429 in direct contravention of the Treaty of. In response, Henry had himself crowned as Henry II of France in the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris on 6 December 1431, although loyalists to Charles VII disputed his right to do so. Henry returned to England in February 1432, and he would never set foot in France again. But he was also naive, injudicious, and at times irrationally suspicious of those who disagreed with him. Neither was Charles the Dauphin, prepared to sit idly and watch his inheritance be handed over to the English. Thirdly, the very character of England's king was, as he reached maturity, about to become a serious disadvantage. The young Henry was tall, well-educated, fluent in English and French, and he liked hunting, but there were serious flaws in his character. Here, the historian N. Saul summarizes the common view of Henry VI by historians past and present. It would be difficult to imagine anyone less capable than Henry VI. Henry and his ruling council had continued to press his family's claim for the French throne. The fortunes of the 100 Years' War briefly swung back in favor of the English during the early 1430s. In 1436, Henry made Sir John Talbot the Constable of France. But it was also the year that Paris was lost. Meanwhile, the English Parliament and nobles were concerned at the huge cost of the war and the distinct lack of territorial gains. Henry VI was now ruling alone without his regents, but his aversion to warfare proved unpopular, and his choice of associates even more so, especially William de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk. The Earl did, however, negotiate a 5-year truce with France from 1444. The price to pay for peace was the loss of Maine and, on the 22nd of April 1445, the marriage of Henry to Margaret of Anne, niece of Charles VII. As both actions failed to end the war, Henry's popularity sank even lower as nobles resented his capitulation and anti-war nobles lamented the continuance of a seemingly never-ending and costly war. The obvious influence of the Queen on her weak-willed husband was yet another bone of contention amongst the court officials. There was even a rebellion by commoners and local dignitaries led by the former soldier, Jack Cade, in 1450, which called for the removal of certain corrupt and inept court officials and a return to law and order in the southeast. The Earl was executed for his failures, but his replacement, the Earl of Somerset, could not turn things around, and he lost Rouen. France was too rich in men and resources, while England was bankrupt and led by a king with no appetite for conflict. In 1453, even Gascony, which the English crown had held for 3 centuries, was lost, and with it the 100 Years' War. The only French territory still in Henry's hands was Calais, and just as one war ended, another was about to begin. The message was that Henry was neglecting the necessities of everyday government, even if the rebellion fizzled out after causing much destruction in London. At least, in 1440–41, Henry had found time to create 2 famous institutions of education: Eton College, Berkshire, and King's College, Cambridge. The king funded impoverished scholars and poor commoners, who could study first at Eton and then move on to King's College. In 1448, Margaret founded Queen's College in Cambridge. Things got even worse in France when the Earl of Suffolk invaded Brittany, but only succeeded in losing control of Normandy in 1450. In 1453, on top of the defeats in France, or perhaps because of them, Henry suffered his first bout of insanity. The episode lasted 17 months, during which the king understood nothing of what was said to him or even recognized anybody. A white rose for York and a red rose for Lancaster. The division was a little more complex than merely these 2 families, as each one garnered allies amongst England's other noble families. Loyalties often being decided because Henry VI had unwisely personally involved himself with disputes between them. Consequently, the war raged between 2 wide groups known as the Yorkists and the However, the wars really only involved the nobility and their retainers, and not the wider populace, with many of the battles being better described as skirmishes. The condition may have been inherited from his maternal grandfather Charles VI of France. As a result of the king's incapacity, his poor record in the war with France, and the corruption in the royal court, Richard, the Duke of York, was made the protector of the realm in March 1454. The Duke and the Earl of Somerset were soon at odds, as each tried to get themselves nominated as Henry's, and this was the start of what became known as the Wars of the Roses. The Duke of York was the great-grandson of Edward III and the nephew of the Earl of March, who himself had claimed he was the legitimate heir to Richard II of England. The Earl of Somerset was also a descendant of Edward III, but through that king's son, John of Gaunt, father of Henry IV of England, first ruler of the House of Lancaster. The name, The Wars of the Roses, was applied to this rivalry by the novelist Sir Walter Scott, after the later badges of the 2 families. In 1455, the Duke of York imprisoned the Earl of Somerset in the Tower of London. But he was later released by a somewhat recovered King Henry. Somerset was then killed at the Battle of St. Albans on the 22nd of May 1455 by an army led by an outraged Duke Richard. On the 25th of March 1458, to reconcile the Yorkists and Lancastrians, and even oblige them to walk hand in hand in a procession in London. However, the peace did not last long, and Richard still faced a formidable obstacle to his ambitions in the form of the Queen. Queen Margaret hated Richard so intensely, she even led an army against the Duke, defeating him at his headquarters in Ludlow at the Battle of Ludford Bridge on the 12th of October 1459. The Duke of York fled to Ireland while Parliament, the 1459 Parliament of Devils, identified him as a traitor and disinherited his heirs. Even the king was struck by an arrow in the neck during the battle and only just fled the scene. It was a mere skirmish, but it was the first battle of the Wars of the Roses. Richard, realizing the king could easily be manipulated, then swore loyalty to Henry, who managed. In 1460, the fortunes were reversed, and a Yorkist army led by Richard, Neville, the Earl of Warwick and Richard's son, Edward, Earl of March, defeated Queen Margaret's army at Northampton on the 10th of July, and then captured King Henry. Richard, the Duke of York, returned from Ireland and persuaded Henry, who was now in the Tower of London, to name him as the official heir to the throne, a decision ratified by the Act of Accord of the 24th of October. However, at the Battle of Wakefield on the 30th of December 1460, the Duke of York was killed, and his army defeated by Henry VI, loyalists led once again by the Queen. Margaret ensured that Richard's head was displayed on a pike at Micklegate in York, adding a paper crown to remind everyone he had been a mere usurper. On the 17th of February 1461, another Yorkist army, led by the Earl of Warwick, was defeated at St Albans, and Henry was rescued from his captivity. The Wars of the Roses were not over yet, though. Edward, the Duke of York's son, backed by the Earl of Warwick, was promoted as a replacement to his father and to King Henry. When Edward won the bloody Battle of Towton in March 1461, the largest and longest battle in English history, this is indeed what transpired. Henry VI was deposed, and he, Queen Margaret, and their son Edward all fled to Scotland. Edward of York, just 19 years of age, was crowned Edward IV of England at Westminster Abbey on the 28th of June 1461. Even this was still not the end of the Civil War, merely a pause. While Queen Margaret and Prince Edward made it from Scotland to the greater safety of France, Henry VI was captured in Lancashire in July 1465 and imprisoned in the Tower of London again, where he was, at least, allowed to keep his pet dog and sparrow. There was to be another twist in the Roses' War. When the Earl of Warwick and King Edward quarrelled over the latter's marriage to Elizabeth, Warwick joined forces with Queen Margaret and defeated King Edward's army at Northampton in the Battle of Edgecote Moor. Warwick imprisoned Edward IV in his castle at Middleham. Meanwhile, Henry VI was briefly reinstated as king on the 11th of April 1470, and he had his second English coronation, and third overall, in October of that year, this time in St. Paul's Cathedral. Edward IV was not to be deprived, though, and, backed by an Anglo-Dutch army, he won the Battle of Barna on the 14th of April 1471 against his ex-ally ward. The battle was the first in England to see both sides use artillery as a major weapon, with Warwick killed in the aftermath of Barnet, and Henry's only son killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury on the 4th of May 1471. Edward was back on the throne. Henry, deposed for a second time, also found himself a prisoner yet again. A few weeks later, on the 21st of May 1471, the ex-king, now aged 49, was stabbed to death in the Tower of London, according to traditional accounts. Edward V was killed even before he had a chance to be crowned, most likely by his uncle Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, in the Tower of London, along with his younger brother Richard. Curiously, the Duke of Gloucester had been on duty in the Tower of London the night of Henry VI's murder. The Duke of Gloucester made himself king, Richard III, and won a place in history as one of the most despised of all English monarchs. The Wars of the Roses rumbled on, and Richard was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August 1485. The victorious Henry Tudor of the House of Lancaster then became king, Henry VII of England, and marrying Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward, for in 1486 the two rival houses were finally united and a new one created. The Tudors, dead from displeasure and melancholy according to King Edward's official announcement, and from a bashed skull according to a 1910 forensic examination, the dead king's body was put on display for any doubters to see and then buried at Chertsey Abbey and later moved to Windsor Castle. Queen Margaret was imprisoned, but was eventually released on payment of a ransom by her father, the King of Sicily, and she lived the rest of her days in her native France. Edward IV would reign until his death in 1483. after which his son Edward V of England briefly became king from April to June of that year. Henry VII of England ruled as king from 1485 to 1509 CE. Henry, representing the Lancaster cause during the Wars of the Roses, defeated and killed his predecessor, the Yorkist King Richard III of England, at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 CE, known as Henry of Richmond or Henry Tudor before he was crowned. Henry VII was the first Tudor king. Despite having to deal with 3 pretenders to his throne and 2 minor rebellions, Henry's reign was largely peaceful and prosperous, as, like a master auditor, he steadily increased the health of the state's finances. The king died of ill health in April 1509 CE, and was succeeded by his eldest surviving son, Henry VIII of England. Richard III was one of England's most unpopular kings, and he was accused of being involved in the murder of the 2 sons of his brother, Edward IV of England, who disappeared from the Tower of London. Henry was the grandson of the Welsh courtier Owen Tudor and Catherine of Valois. Other allies included such powerful lords as the Duke of Buckingham, who were not happy with King Richard's distribution of estates, and anyone else keen to see Richard III receive his just deserts. These allies even included the new king across the Channel, Charles VIII of France. The first move by the rebels proved premature and poorly planned, so that Henry's invasion fleet was put off by bad weather and Buckingham was captured and executed in November 1483 CE. The daughter of Charles VI of France, former wife of Henry V of England, and mother of Henry VI of England. Henry Tudor's mother was Margaret Beaufort, the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster and son of Edward III of England. It was not much of a royal connection, especially as some regarded the Beauforts as illegitimate, but it was the best the Lancastrians could hope for, as their dynastic dispute with the House of York, the Wars of the Roses, rumbled on. Thus, Henry Tudor, returning from exile in Brittany, became the figurehead of the Lancastrians, who aimed to topple the Yorkist King Richard III. Having eliminated his nephews, made himself king in 1483. His reign would be short and troubled. It was brought to an end by the rise of Henry Tudor, at the time better known as Henry Earl of Richmond. Henry was born on the 28th of January 1457 CE in Pembroke Castle, the son of Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Henry Tudor wisely allied himself with the alienated family of Elizabeth Woodville, the wife of Edward IV. The Lancastrian cause was given a dramatic boost when Richard III's son and heir, Edward, died on the 9th of April 1484 CE. On the 8th of August 1485 CE, the Wars of the Roses reached boiling point when Henry Tudor landed with an army of French mercenaries at Milford Haven in South Wales, a force perhaps no bigger than 5,000 men. Henry's army swelled in numbers as it marched to face the King's army at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. On the 22nd of August 1485 CE, Richard, although commanding an army of some 8,000 men, was at the last moment deserted by some of his key allies, and the Earl of Northumberland even refused to engage his troops, until he had a clear idea which side was going to win the day. Nevertheless, the king fought bravely and perhaps a little foolishly in his efforts to kill Henry Tudor with his own sword. Richard, although managing to strike down Henry's, had his horse cut from under him, and the king was killed. The victorious Henry Tudor, according to legend, was given Richard's crown, found by Lord William Stanley beneath a hawthorn bush at Bosworth Field. The new king was crowned Henry VII of England on the 30th of October 1485 CE in Westminster, marrying Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, on the 18th of January 1486 CE. The two rival houses were finally united, and a new one created. The Tudors, The battles of the Wars of the Roses were over. Half the English barons had been killed in the process, but England was at last united as it left the Middle Ages and headed into the modern era. The War of the Roses might have ended according to the history books, but King Henry still had plenty of unrest in his realm. His first problem was that he had few loyal followers, coming as he did from years of exile. The first was a joiner's son, Lambert Simnar, who claimed he was the Earl of Warwick. An unfortunate boast, as the king already had the real Earl safely locked up in the Tower of London. Simnel and his supporters were roundly beaten at the Battle of East Stoke on the 16th of June, 1487 CE. The impostor was then made to work in the palace kitchens to learn some humility. This situation had its advantages, as the king formed the Privy Chamber and Council of Close Advisers, allowing him to keep a tight personal hold on the reins of power and physically limiting access to the royal person. Warbeck had the support of several foreign kings, eager to destabilize England, but he was defeated in battle, in Cornwall, in October 1497 CE, and he confessed that his claims were nonsense. Warbeck was imprisoned and then executed in 1499 CE. Specialized committees, mostly populated with lawyers, were set the task of ruling the kingdom, all personally supervised by the king. Both rebellions were easily dealt with, although the Earl of Northumberland was killed in Yorkshire. A third and final Yorkist claimant was Edmund de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, captured in 1506 CE and executed in 1513. Sir Henry's throne was now secure, and the seal which indicated the new dynasty was his creation of the Tudor Rose, an amalgamation of the livery badges of the two rival houses, the red rose of the Lancasters and the white rose of the Yorks. Of the outsiders of the king's inner circle, the most dangerous were to Yorkists pretenders, impostors to the throne. The second and more serious challenge came from Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York. Other minor rebellions, fueled by lingering Yorkists, included Viscount Francis S. rebellion of 1486 CE in southeast England, and another around Thirsk, Yorkshire in 1489 CE, where tax hikes fueled unrest. Not only effective at getting rid of his rivals, Henry was an extremely efficient ruler in terms of finances. Through a mixture of taxes, feudal dues, rents, and fines, Henry was able to double state revenues during his reign. In 1489 CE, an army was sent to help Brittany maintain its independence from France, and Boulogne was briefly besieged. Henry was perhaps initially eager to repay the dukedom for looking after him during his childhood exile there. This was done not only by imposing on them fines and debts and limiting their ability to form private armies, but by establishing councils in Wales, the north, and the west of England to better control them. The rise and dominance of the barons, which had so troubled Henry's predecessors and ensured the Wars of the Roses had dragged on so long, was at an end. Even the evolution of Parliament went backwards during Henry's reign. Still an institution only really called to approve new taxes. In the 23 years of Henry's reign, Parliament sat only 6 times, an indicator that English government was still medieval and the monarch still absolute. However, by 1492 CE he had backed down after suitable financial compensation was forthcoming from Charles VIII of France, who lived up to his nickname Charles the Affable. The latter tactic, that is, imposing fines, proved particularly lucrative, as the king charged misdemeanors ranging from bad behavior at court to possessing too many armed retainers. One fiendish financial strategy was to issue a penal bond to anyone already caught guilty of a financial misdemeanor or fine. If a person failed to meet any of his existing financial obligations, then under this second signed declaration, the king could confiscate their property and ruin them, Many nobles were kept under the king's thumb in this way, with a financial guillotine perpetually hovering over them. The number of nobles also went down as the new position of surveyor of the king's wards sought out money that was owed the king and confiscated lands to bolster Henry's ever-growing estates. Henry even made money from his one major foreign expedition. Another source of income was the massive increase in duties, which came from the boom in trade, as England signed off treaties with Denmark, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, and Florence. Trade was further encouraged by the Crown, investing in a small fleet of merchant ships and establishing for it a fortified base at Portsmouth. The king was even keen to find brand new trading places, famously funding the pioneering voyage of the Genoese merchant John Cabot to Newfoundland. Cabot sailed in his vessel, the Matthew, from Bristol in 1497 CE. Successful in his endeavour, Cabot died on the return journey to England, and his family, true to Henry VII's reputation as a miser, received the paltry sum of £10 from the king. Eventually, this obsession with enriching the state led to the king becoming unpopular, but by then he had already firmly reasserted royal power over the nobility. A tight hold on the state's purse strings did not in any way put Henry off spending on his own projects and displaying his great love of pomp and pageantry, especially medieval tournaments. 1489 CE became the Queen of Scots when she married King James IV of Scotland on the 8th of August 1503 CE. This union of the thistle and rose was an amicable termination of the difficult relations caused by James II of the Pretender War. The marriage ensured a lasting peace between the two countries. Another of Henry VII's daughters, Mary, became the Queen of France. Another example of Henry's diplomatic efforts to increase England's prestige in the wider world. Royal residences received particular attention with Windsor Castle, the Tower of London, Westminster Abbey, Richmond Palace, and Greenwich Palace, all being built or refurbished. The weddings of the king's children were another area of lavish spending. These included the marriage of the Spanish Princess Catherine of Aragon to Henry, who became heir when his older brother Arthur died in 1502 CE, aged just 15. The king suffered another tragic blow the next year. Queen Elizabeth died during childbirth, aged 37. This marked the decline of the king, who retreated to as much a life of solitude as being a monarch allowed. There was some positive news. In the first years of the 16th century CE, the king's daughter, Margaret B. Henry VII died of ill health on the 21st of April 1509 CE at Richmond Palace in Surrey. The king was buried alongside his queen in Westminster Abbey, and their tomb was eventually encased in bronze sculpted by Pietro. Henry VII's fiscal policies might have earned him a certain level of unpopularity, as evidenced by the execution of his two principal lawyers after the king's own death, but he had set the ship of state on a sure course for future expansion and prosperity. He was succeeded by his eldest namesake son, who, aged just 17, was crowned Henry VIII on the 24th of June, 1509. Henry VIII, inheriting a financially sound kingdom, was a young, athletic, and charismatic ruler who would become one of the great kings of English history. His reign would entertain future historians with his search for a male heir and 6 wives, and it would witness such momentous events as the formation of the Church of England. Henry VIII of England ruled as king from 1509 to 1547. The second Tudor king after his father, Henry VII of England, Henry had inherited a kingdom which enjoyed both unity and sound finances. Famous for his 6 wives as he searched for a male heir, the king was charismatic and domineering. In order to escape his first marriage, Henry set himself against the Pope, and so began the Reformation of the Church in England. whereby it broke away from Rome and the English monarch became its supreme head. A larger-than-life figure, Henry centralised government, further absorbed Wales into his kingdom, saw to the dissolution of the formed the Royal Navy, and built magnificent palaces such as St. James in London. When Henry died, though, in 1547, he was succeeded by his juvenile son Edward VI of England, and he left him an impoverished kingdom split over religious issues. Henry Tudor had defeated and killed Richard III of England at the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485, in the last major action of England's dynastic dispute, known as the Wars of the Roses. The House of Lancaster had finally defeated the House of York, but Henry, crowned Henry VII of England in October 1485, was intent on creating a brand new ruling house. The Tudors. Henry married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV of England, on the 18th of January 1486, and he even combined the livery badges of York and Lancaster to create a new royal symbol, the Tudor rose. England was about to enter the post-medieval era with a new look and a new type of monarchy. Henry VII had seen off a few final challenges to his rule, and set about filling the state coffers as much as he could, strengthening the crown and weakening the nobility in the process. The king's eldest son was Arthur, and he had married the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, daughter of King Ferdinand II, in 1501. Unfortunately, Arthur died the next year, aged just 15. The king's next eldest son, Henry, born on the 28th of June 1491 at Greenwich Palace, became the heir to the throne, and in 1503 he was made the Prince of Wales. Henry VII was keen to maintain friendly relations with Spain, and so Prince Henry, after special permission was gained from the Pope, was betrothed to Catherine of Aragon. When Henry VII died of illness on the 21st of April 1509, Prince Henry became king. As arranged, he married Catherine on the 11th of June and was crowned Henry VIII in Westminster Abbey on the 24th of June 1509. Contrary to the later and more famous portraits of Henry VIII, in his youth, the king got an athletic figure and 1.9 meters tall with red hair and beard, an imposing one. Not for nothing was he a champion of the medieval tournaments his father had loved to organize. The prince was also a fine archer, horseman, and tennis player, and when he was at rest he composed poetry and music, and brushed up on his impressive knowledge of theology. In short, Henry was an intelligent and charismatic character who charmed all he met. The historian John Miller gives the following summary of Henry's powerful but changing character. Henry was strong-willed, shrewd, capable of being moved to fits of generosity and enthusiasm, but also to savage anger. As a young man, he was determined to enjoy being king and to outshine his contemporaries. As he passed his prime, he became suspicious, capricious, devious, and sometimes cruel. Henry, perpetually in search of a male heir, went through an incredible 6 wives. These, and the children they bore, were Catherine of Aragon, Mary Ann Boleyn, Elizabeth, Jane Seymour, Edward Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr. The sole survivor was Mary, born on the 18th of February 1516. Henry had an illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond, with a mistress, one Elizabeth Blount, but that was not much use to a king who craved a recognized heir. Meanwhile, Henry and Anne Boleyn lived together. Henry had a second daughter, Elizabeth, born on the 7th of September 1533. However, when the king discovered that Anne had had an affair, and his eye had been caught by his next wife, he ordered her execution. Catherine suffered the same fate as Anne Boleyn when she, too, was accused of having an extramarital affair with a member of the court. One Thomas Culpeper, and an incriminating love letter was produced at her hearing before Parliament. Catherine, then in her 30s, was a more mature lady than her immediate predecessors, and perhaps because of this, the marriage was a success and the family home a happy one. Catherine outlived Henry but died from complications of childbirth in September 1548. Catherine was executed in the Tower of London in February 1542. The charge, and others ranging from incest to witchcraft, were trumped up because Anne had not produced a healthy male sibling to accompany Elizabeth, and the king had tired of their turbulent relationship. Anne was found guilty and executed at the Tower of London in May 1536. A few weeks later, Henry married his third wife, Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting at court, and she finally gave the king a son, Edward, born on the 12th of October 1537. The long-awaited arrival of a male heir sparked off gun salutes, bell-ringing, and banquets across England. Tragically, Jane died shortly after, and Henry genuinely mourned her passing. Of all his wives, it is significant that this was the one he wished to be buried alongside. Sometime in December 1532, perhaps seeing a baby as the best way to rid herself of her rival Catherine, did sleep with the king and became pregnant. There would be serious repercussions regarding the church, but eventually Henry had his marriage annulled the next year. Catherine died of cancer in January 1536. The king began looking for a new wife, and he found his ideal candidate in Anne Boleyn, younger sister of one of the king's former conquests, and insisted on marrying the king before any thoughts could be entertained of raising a family. Was wife number 4. But she displeased the English king. He had been misled by an overly flattering portrait of her by Hans Holbein, the younger, before they had met in person. Henry married her anyway, but, rudely calling her the Flanders mare, changed his mind a few months later, and they divorced by mutual consent on 9 July 1540. Anne was relieved to escape with her life, but Henry gave her a generous allowance, enough to live the high life until her death in 1557. Henry's problem, then, was how to relieve himself of Catherine, an issue known as the King's Great Matter. The English king's first marriage to Catherine of Aragon produced 6 children, but all except one died in infancy. The solution seemed to be a letter to the Pope, suggesting that the lack of a male heir was God's punishment for Henry marrying the wife of his late brother, a point supported by the Old Testament. Consequently, the king wished for the Pope to annul the marriage. Unfortunately for Henry, Pope Clement VII was keen to keep good favor with the most powerful ruler in Europe at the time, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V of Spain, who was, significantly, the nephew of Catherine. Further, it was unlikely that Catherine and Arthur, being so young at the time, had ever slept together, and so the prohibition of Leviticus did not, in this case, apply. The Pope at least sent Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio to England to investigate the matter and preside over a special court in June 1529. Here both Catherine, determined to stay queen, and Henry, determined to get himself a new queen, presented their respective cases. Despite Campeggio's efforts, nothing was resolved. Henry's next tactic was to permanently separate Catherine from her daughter, Mary, and shift her about the country to various dilapidated residences, with Anne Boleyn, often known as Anne of 1,000 Days, for her brief reign as Queen of the King's Hut. Anne of Cleves' wife, number 5, was Catherine Howard, then only a teenager and another lady-in-waiting at court that had caught the king's eye. The 6th and final wife was Catherine Parr, already a 2-time widow. Unlike many of his medieval predecessors who relied on feudal ties of loyalty, Henry created a court where even lower nobles could get on if they gained the king's favor. The king carefully selected a group of wise men to rule his kingdom for him, and chief amongst these was Thomas Wolsey. English was made the official language, and Welsh was banned in official circles. Ireland proved a little more difficult, but the king's ambition to create a centralised kingdom is indicated by his adoption of the title King of Ireland in 1541, where previous English kings had only called themselves Lord of Ireland. Finally, the remote north of England was kept in tighter check by the establishment of the Council of the North after 1536. Wolsey was the son of a butcher, but he would eventually rise to become Cardinal Archbishop of York. One of his successors as sole minister to the king was an equally ambitious individual, Thomas Cromwell, son of a blacksmith. Both Wolsey and Cromwell would eventually displease the king. The former for his lack of success in resolving the great matter, and the latter for the Anne of Cleves debacle. Both men would be tried for treason. They would be replaced from 1540 by the Privy Council, which regained some of its former function, and so high government once again involved a cabinet of ministers, rather than a single, all-powerful one who could monopolize the king. Henry VIII also made good use of Parliament, and that institution went from strength to strength as his reign went on. In 1536, Wales was further integrated into the state apparatus of England and divided into 13 counties in 1543. Henry was a keen scholar of theology, and he had no intention of leaving such an important institution as the Church to its own devices. The king wrote a treatise which attacked Lutheranism and was rewarded by the Pope, honoring him in 1521 with the title Defender of the Faith. Many regarded the Church as too rich and too full of priests, abusing their position. The king would brook no opposition, though, and 178 of the protesters, including their leader Robert Aske, were executed in June 1537. Another move towards independence was the king's approval for a translation of the Bible in English in 1539. It is important to remember, though, that Henry was not dead set on reforming the doctrine of the Church. His commitment to traditional Catholic practices such as Mass confession and clerical celibacy is evidenced in the 1539 Act of 6 Articles. Certainly not everyone, however, was in agreement with Henry's break from the Pope. Consequently, there were both executions and uprisings. Chief obstacle at court was Sir Thomas More, Henry's former Chancellor, who disagreed with the divorce with Catherine and Henry's presumption to put himself above the Pope. More was executed for his beliefs in July 1535. Relations turned sour, though, when Henry wanted his marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and the king blamed both the Pope and Wolsey for the lack of progress in the matter. Wolsey was eventually accused of treason, but he died on his way to trial in 1530. When Thomas Cromwell took over the case, Henry's will was pushed to its logical conclusion. England would run its own church free from the obligations of Rome. Thomas, the Archbishop of Canterbury, formally annulled Henry's first marriage in May 1533. This annulment and Parliament's passing of the Act of Succession meant that Catherine's daughter Mary was declared illegitimate. Anne Boleyn was crowned queen in June, and her daughter Elizabeth, born in September 1533, was thus recognized as the king's official heir. Henry was excommunicated by the Pope for his actions, but by now the whole affair had taken on a significance far beyond royal marriages. In order to replace the Pope as head of the Catholic Church in England, Henry made himself supreme head of the Church of England. This was achieved by the Act of Supremacy of the 28th of November 1534, and meant that Henry and all subsequent English monarchs only had one higher authority: God himself. The next scene in this momentous drama came in 1536, when Henry presented Parliament with a bill to abolish all monasteries in his kingdom. The dissolution of the monasteries, the bill was passed, and the estates of the monasteries were redistributed to the Crown and Henry's supporters, the abbots of Glastonbury, Colchester, Reading and Woburn were all hanged, and the last monastery to close was Waltham Abbey in Essex in March 1540. A good many subjects were keen to see reform in the Church of England, and so continue the Protestant Reformation movement that was sweeping across Europe. The most notable episode of unrest was in Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, where Catholics gathered in protest in the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536. Every inch the medieval king, Henry VIII, seemed to dismiss the realities of post-medieval Europe and embarked on a series of military campaigns like so many of his predecessors had done. Despite Henry's sister Margaret having married King James IV of Scotland in 1503, Henry sent an army north and won a resounding victory at Flodden in 1513, where James IV was killed, which included jousting, hunting, and banquets, involved masses of luxury tents, and was held as a magnificent if somewhat empty show of friendship between England and France. Henry and Francis I of France. Thus, by the end of his reign, the king had overspent on war and frivolities, and rampant inflation meant that the pot of gold his father had carefully accumulated had all been squandered. Henry, cruel and vindictive, had few friends left, and a kingdom divided over religious matters. Henry VIII, then, whose early reign had promised so much, left little in terms of a lasting legacy except a plethora of portraits, silent testimony to one man's vanity and delusions of imperial grandeur. Another invading army attacked Edinburgh in 1544, but was defeated at the Battle of More in 1545. Scotland became an unsolved problem that Henry's successors would have to deal with. The fleet included the great warships Mary Rose and Henry Graysar. The former was Henry's magnificent flagship ship, but it sank in the Solent River in 1545 with the loss of 500 lives. The wreck was salvaged in 1982. Eager to make an impression everywhere, the king also built the fine palaces of Whitehall and St James in London and significantly revamped Hampton Court Palace. The grandest of all was Nonsuch in Surrey, a private pleasure palace for the king that was built to commemorate 30 years of rule. The name derived from the boast that no such finer place existed anywhere, and it was indeed an extravagant residence where the king could enjoy his favourite pastimes of hunting and hawking. Nonsuch was not completed until after the king's death, and, after going through various owners, was finally demolished in the 17th century. Henry, again, like many of his predecessors, could not resist a stab at conquering France. However, of his several invasions across the Channel, none were particularly successful. Despite a minor naval victory at the Battle of the Spurs, Henry changed tack, and his sister, Mary, was married off to Louis XII of France. In 1514, in 1518, Henry settled for the status quo in Europe, and a mutual defence agreement was signed with France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. To pay for these expensive on-off wars in Scotland and France, Henry was obliged to sell off the lands he had confiscated from the church to any noble who put in a decent offer. The high costs and the lack of wealth of England compared to far richer France meant Henry had to abandon another series of campaigns in the 1540s, and he did well to settle for a peace deal in 1546, where he at least won control of Boulogne for 8 years. A happier escapade on French soil was the Field of the Cloth of Gold, a spectacular show of pomp and pageantry held just outside Calais in June 1520. The event, another of Henry's successes, and one with far-reaching consequences for the history of England, was his creation of the Royal Navy. All of Henry VIII's 60 houses were lavishly furnished with tapestries, fine art, and gold and silver plates. Henry VIII's health declined rapidly in his later years. The King of England suffered a badly ulcerated leg, and was so overweight he had to be pushed around on a wheeled contraption. The king died on the 28th of January 1547 at Whitehall Palace in London. He was 55 years old. Henry was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, next to his late third wife, Jane Seymour. Henry was succeeded by his son, Edward VI. Crowned in Westminster Abbey on the 20th of February 1547, Edward was only 9, and he would die of tuberculosis in 1553. He was succeeded by another short-reigning monarch, his half-sister Mary I, who reigned until 1558. Henry VIII's second daughter then became Queen Elizabeth I, and with her in swept the Golden Age of England.